Greetings, my friends. Welcome to the Webster Memorial United Church's online Bible study series focused on the book of Genesis. Last week, we explored the principle of purpose as we looked at Joseph and his story in the book of Genesis, chapter 39. We made the point that Joseph had a concept and an understanding of his purpose that allowed him to be faithful to the same. We explore the issue of temptation and the enticement, entitlement, entrapment, and enforcement that surround temptation. And we made the point that faithfulness will always be tested, that faithfulness does not guarantee us a trouble-free existence, and that faithfulness is possible when we follow God's will. And Joseph in that story declared, "I will not bow." Today I want to conclude the series by focusing on the principle of truth. Again, using Joseph's story from Genesis chapter 42, from verse 6 through 26. And I want to frame it in this way. Joseph declared about truth, "I will not bend." If we understand an ethical dilemma as a choice between two competing rights, then we are constantly wrestling with choices and their possible consequences. A few examples would be useful at this point. If I am unemployed and a believer, should I apply to the cigarette company for a job? Should I join the military? And though it is legal, as a believer, should I practice tax avoidance? Of course, evasion is unlawful. At the corporate level of the church, what are our views about the death penalty, abortion, the harvesting of the eggs of a dead woman, and genetic engineering? Because we live in times that could be described as shifting sand, we are challenged as believers to constantly examine and explore our understanding of faith in the context in which we live. The point I wish to make is that positions on doctrines and ethical practices have changed and will continue to change within the context of life and living. Many denominations, for instance, have changed their ordination standards to allow professing gay ministers to serve within congregations in many parts of the world. It becomes even more complicated when the states redefine and legalize same-sex unions. In such cases, the legal and the religious moral views are seemingly at odds. Churches must now determine the credentials of those who wish to serve in the ministries to our children to guard against child sexual abuse. Pastors have contracts, and believers have little hesitation in taking another to court. Whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, whether we are comfortable with it or not, the landscape of how we worship and serve and witness and do mission is constantly shifting, and the temptation facing the traditional church is to do all it can to preserve its traditions, its culture, its liturgy, its ministry, and dare I say it, its relevance. Critically, the issues will not go away. They are part and parcel of living in these times. What I will say is this: in retreating or confronting the times, the task of the church and the task of believers is to remain theocentric. That means God is the central interest and ultimate concern in our lives. And this is rooted in God's declared purpose for us and for our world. And this will never change. How we declare and express it will always have to be modified to be relevant for the times. In Joseph's encounter with his brothers in Genesis 45, this principle is clearly identified. I share with you some definitions that will help us to interpret this passage. Values are our fundamental beliefs. They are the principles we use to define what is right good, and just. Morals are values which we attribute to a system of beliefs, typically a religious system, where our authority comes from a higher being. Ethics has to do with our actions and decisions. When we act in ways that are consistent with our beliefs, we declare such actions as ethical. When we act counter to our beliefs, then we act unethically. I noted that an ethical dilemma occurs where the choice is not what we believe to be right and what we believe to be wrong, but between two competing rights. When we act in ways that are consistent with our beliefs, we declare such actions to be ethical. So here is the truth. God requires truth of us, but truth is always an ethical choice we make. I wish then to offer this reflection on the ethical choice of truth, restated as the renewed attitude we should either discover or rediscover, grounded in the little label or tagline, I will not bend. By chapter 41 of Genesis, Joseph has been elevated from Pharaoh's prison to Pharaoh's palace. This Hebrew man, pushed into a pit by his jealous and angry brothers, and parceled and purchased as a slave, propositioned and pursued by Potiphar's wife, punished by imprisonment for his persistence to abide by his religious virtues and unwillingness to bow to the temptation of entitlement, had become prime minister of all of Egypt. He was extremely gifted and demonstrated his genius in planning and forecasting, organizational, financial, and operations management. To tip it off, because of his faithfulness, God was causing Joseph's actions to prosper. The reunion with his brothers took place within the context of life and death issues. The existing famine for which Joseph had prepared Egypt had spread to Canaan, and Jacob unknowingly sends his sons to Prime Minister Joseph, his once favorite son, to purchase food. In chapter 42, verse 6 to 24, Joseph and his brothers have the first of 4 encounters or conversations. If you look at chapter 43, 27 to 31, chapter 44, 15 to 45, chapter 45, 13, and chapter 50, 15 to 21, you'll see these encounters. And while he immediately recognizes them, they do not recognize him. Is it not true that you can victimize a person and somehow in the future fall within the ambit of their powers and control, and you're never the wiser for it? This challenging family reunion was fully loaded, and there are 4 facets of truth resident in these encounters between Joseph and his brothers, which are critical for our reflection. And the first is this: truth can sometimes be painful. Truth can sometimes be painful. Given the history of their relationship, Joseph, to my mind, had 2 choices: revenge or justice. I came across an interesting comparison between revenge and justice written by Dr. Leon Seltzer. Admitting that there are generalizations and that there are some exceptions, he says that revenge is predominantly emotional. Justice is rational. Revenge comprises negative emotions. Pleasure is derived from the suffering of others. Justice is logical, legal, and ethically defined. It is about righting the wrong. Revenge is by nature personal, to get even, or to have a private vendetta exercised. Justice is impersonal and impartial. Revenge is an act of vindictiveness, can become corrupting. Justice is an act of vindication. Revenge is about cycles, repeating itself, ongoing feuds, family, etc. Justice is about closure, resolution. Revenge is about retaliation, usually worse than that which was committed. Justice is about restoring balance. Joseph opted for justice. but not natural justice. He opted for another kind of justice, divine justice. And divine justice reflects the divine purpose. It is justice that never offers the other what they rightly deserve, but offers them that which is in their best interest, undergirded and guided by a principle we shall talk about shortly. The biblical scholars among us would suggest that a close reading of the first two encounters between Joseph and his brothers, while not exactly exacting revenge for what they had done to him, would seem to demonstrate some form of payback. Joseph ensured that their current experiences with him would mirror his past experiences with them when they threw him into the pit and sold him into slavery. The elements of retribution, revenge, retaliation are seemingly evident if we look closely enough. The dream was indeed fulfilled. They bowed to him in chapter 41:51. He places them in temporary custody for 3 days, 42:17, similar to his pit experience. He challenges their integrity and forces them to leave one brother, Simeon, to ensure their release and to promise to bring the remaining brother, Benjamin, upon their return in verse 19. He places silver in their bags, a reminder that he was sold for silver, and a significant source of discomfort for them in the face of his seemingly hostile prime ministerial approach. Jacob is forced to make the ethical choice between life and death. The family will die as a consequence of the famine, or he will lose his remaining favored son, Benjamin. When they returned the second time with Benjamin, Joseph continued, it seems, to terrorize them. He did not meet them at first and kept them in abeyance about the money that had been discovered in their possession from the first visit, but which they could not have spent, and while he acts as a host to them, they are never comfortable. Then the final harsh test is with Benjamin and the silver cup. The brothers faced their own ethical dilemma. As they did with Joseph, will they sacrifice one of their own, another favored by their father, in order to save their own skins? In a sense, you feel sorry for the brothers, and indeed the entire family. The way Joseph kept throwing one thing after the other at them, it makes for painful reading, if not a painful gaze in the mirror of family life. Yet an equally close examination of the chapters would reveal that even if the treatment seemed harsh or resembled payback for the past actions done to him, there is no evidence to show that Joseph took any pleasure in their activities. In fact, the reverse was true. Joseph the dreamer became Joseph the weeper. Upon their confession of guilt in 42:24, he turns away and weeps. When he is reunited with Benjamin, his mother's son, he hurries away weeping, 45 verse 2. When he reveals his identity, he wept so loudly that the whole household heard it, and he wept when full reconciliation was achieved in chapter 50, verse 17. Those are not actions of one who is exacting vengeance or an extra pound of flesh. His actions belied his motive, which was always to seek reconciliation with his entire family, a reconciliation which required many steps over time, many of which were painful. Despite his best efforts, the relationship with his brothers remained strained, and who could blame them? They remained anxious in his presence and did not respond specifically to what he said. The brother-to-brother relationship was now redefined as one between Lord and servant. They were no longer equals in Joseph's space. My friends, truth can be painful. Have you experienced the truth of relational hurt? Even though truth can be painful, Joseph was true to himself and his faith. His actions, which reflected this attitude, declared, "I will not bend. I will not bend to the desire for revenge, or for retribution, or for retaliation. I will not dish out dirt for dirt or like for like. I will not bend." This is the renewed attitude we need in a time like this. Is this the attitude we have in our congregations, in our communities, in our world? Is this our testimony? Secondly, truth is never self-serving, but always reconciling. To his credit, when he discerns the discomfort and dismay of his brothers, caused no doubt by their view that he would enact and exact judgment and revenge, Joseph shines forth. As one commentator says, Joseph does not scold or blame them. He does not try to make them feel either guilty or shameful. He asks for no confession of sin and issues no absolution. Rather, he wants to allay their fears. Joseph says fundamentally that in spite of their past history, all will be well because what has happened corresponds to God's purposes. He invites them to view the past from the perspective of the present. Everybody is alive. Though they meant evil by selling him into slavery, God intervened and produced something good out of the experience. They opted for a death-dealing choice. God opted for a life-giving choice. Everybody is alive. Joseph's story, therefore, is the theology of life. It is not a theology of promise that was to come, but if the promise was to be realized, then life needed to be preserved. Joseph's encounter with his brothers was a demonstration that he was unwilling to bend to the natural inner forces which affects each of us as a human being. Joseph did not bend to the forces of revenge and retaliation, and despite the tests, he maintained his integrity. He did not cut any corners for his family, and anything they received from Pharaoh was requested by Joseph. Joseph thus confounded those who at every stage of his life sought to put him down or destroy him. His brothers, Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar, by not bending to the natural instincts that often are in conflict with the divine purpose. What an attitude! How many of us are clear that we will not bow or bend to the temptation of entitlement? Our loyalty remains with God, but we bend a little to satiate our human desire for payback. We sometimes separate our profession of faith from our practice on certain matters, and we do so while we still come to church on Sundays, sometimes twice a day. Our options in our relationships are characterized sometimes by death-dealing forces rather than life-giving ones. The cardinal theology, which must guide our living and our relationships, runs from Genesis through to Revelation. God always opts for life. Jesus, the Son of God, declared, "I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." John 10:10. To live by and in truth is a declaration that as believers, we will always opt for life over death. Life over passions and issues that are death-dealing in nature and experience. Life over revenge. Life over injustice. Life over inequality. Life over selfishness. Life over abuse and dehumanization. Life over deception and deceit. I'm trying to make a simple yet profound point. We cannot effectively address some of the ethical challenges of our world, the challenges that we face in our communities, how we use social media, abortion, marital rape, all of those things. We cannot address these challenges until we get our theology right. It is a theology that guides us to the place of truth, where life and life abundantly predominates our motives, our decisions, and our actions. For the simple reason, if in our attitude at heart we do not opt for life, then how can we embrace and relate to the other who differs from us in terms of race or class or gender or sexual orientation, who, like us, is also searching for a space and a place of reconciliation. Whose agenda do we serve when we choose to exclude and pass judgment and declare of others that they are not viable in God's economy on the basis of our differences? Yet there is an accompanying truth also evident in the Joseph story. Divine justice, which is the option for a life-giving choice, led him to pursue reconciliation with his brother and family. God's purpose for reconciliation, the gift of life, is global, communal, and personal. God is not partial regarding this gift. The imago Dei is critical, the image of God. We're all made in that image. To dismiss the other is to miss the opportunity to expose, to bring out the godlike qualities resident in them. The church by nature is an inclusive community built upon the principle of divine justice, which Joseph embodied in this story. And one clear expression of divine justice is the option for reconciliation. When we are reconciled with God, my friends, we value God. When we are reconciled with others, we value people. When we value God and we value people, then God values us as choices, our choices and activities. In summary, therefore, the church's theology, as was the case with Joseph, is the theology of life. Need I remind you that it is for this primary purpose you attend worship services? This divine truth requires the church, and by extension the believer, to understand our purpose as that of a life-giving, life-sustaining, and life-empowering, inclusive, and reconciling community. I wonder if that is true in your community of faith. Given that truth is never self-serving, but reconciling, Joseph's attitude declared, "I will not bend." And frankly, nor will I. I will never bend to the instinct to be separate and unreconciled, to highlight differences rather than celebrate consensus in community. I will never bend to the popular notion of might is right or the herd mentality, but will solidly stand on the life-giving truth that in God you and I are sisters and brothers. Family, we don't always see eye to eye. We don't always take tea or drink coffee or stronger stuff together. But in this place, in the community of faith, in the presence of God, around the communion table, we are a reconciled family, for together we value God. We value one another, and as a result, God values us. I will not bend. But there's a third facet of truth. Not only is it painful at times, not only does it add value, but truth is confrontational. As believers, our ethical choices, guided by the theology of life, should become a template, offering a sense of direction in a death-dealing culture. In a confused and confusing moral landscape, we have to wrestle with the ethical issues, both personal and corporate, and with wisdom and discernment measure these choices against the theology of life. Do we not need to confront and challenge the choices that are made by those among us and those within the society that are clearly characterized by death-dealing elements: injustice, inhumanity, inequity, inequality? Ought we not to offer our reflections on the actions and activities of those among us and those within our society, as well as the institutions with which we interface each time we sense that the said action or activity lacks the marks or the signs of that which is life-giving and life-enabling and life-fulfilling? Ought we not to speak out and speak up? Is it not the task of the believer and the church to help others to critically reflect on their actions to determine whether they meet the standard of that which offers life? Is this not what Joseph did with his family? As painful an experience it was, the brothers had to come face to face with the terror they had caused. They had to see themselves and to reflect on their actions before the process of reconciliation could take place with the victim and the victimizers. Joseph could have simply dealt with them as he did with any other group. Purchase your food and go your way. Let bygones be bygones. He could have opted to say to himself and to all who would listen, these were once my family, but I have no intention of reconnecting with them. I have written them off. Good riddance. But Joseph did not bend to those natural forces. He took the divine path of guiding a process which ultimately broke the death-dealing relationship that had characterized his relationship with his brothers up to that point and worked towards replacing it with a life-giving one. As a believer, and as believers, your task and mine is to be the guiding force and resource relative to the actions and activities around us. We must not bend, but live out our faithfulness as God's people. We're equally challenged by Joseph's story to allow the truth of our theology for life to become a source of influence, a model, if you like, for the culture in which we exist. I take us back to chapter 41 and Joseph's rise to power. Pharaoh's dream was one of future disaster related to the expected famine. Joseph not only interpreted the dream, but offered a plan to avert the disaster. His work of interpretation, his wisdom and discernment provided an entry point into the life of Pharaoh, but more critically enabled God's work of blessing to include the entire human race and not just the chosen ones in Egypt. In simple terms, as an agent of God and an agent of the God of life, he worked with the powerful to ensure the possibility of life for all, the powerful and the powerless. To live in truth is to give tangible expression of our purpose of ensuring that others experience life. Given this truth, I will not bend. I will not bend to the pressures of this culture to remain silent and to let things slide. I will not bend to the temptation to remain ambivalent concerning the actions and activities which render some people as prisoners of their reality. I will not bend to the idea of leaving other people's business alone, when said business negatively impacts a large majority. For to do so is to live a lie. I will not bend to the dictate to turn a blind eye, offer a deaf ear, or to zip my lips. No, I will not bend, but will confront the death-dealing issues in my space and hopefully embolden others around me to do the same, and together we then make a difference. I will not bend. I wonder if you will join me. So we have declared that truth can sometimes be painful. That truth is reconciling. That truth is confrontational. Finally, truth produces hope. To live by and in truth, guided by the theology of life, offers a counterculture by sowing seeds of hope. To plant these seeds of hope requires us to stand out despite our history or our experience, to stand alone if necessary, to confound all others with our option to still believe in the gospel, to still pursue the agenda of inclusion and reconciliation, to still value God, value others, and be valued by God. This is what separates the church from the NGOs of our time. We not only have the goods and services offering relief to those in need, but that which sets us apart and defines and distinguishes us is the truth of the gospel, the good news of and for life. We must never bend to the pressure to abandon this core truth of our theology and therefore our identity. Ours is a task instead, amidst the contradiction and the shifting sands of life, to declare and defend the gospel, which speaks to and provides life, the possibility to prosper in all its fullness. We live in a postmodern, post-Christian era with tremendous advances, but some things have not changed for the believer. Yes, we may have built sophisticated homes with security features, But the God of life still requires us to love and to look out for our neighbor, to seek their best interest. We may have transitioned from the coal pot to the microwave, but the God of life still says feed the widows and orphans, protect and advocate for the despairing. We may have transitioned from the landline to smartphones, but the God of life says the just shall live by faith, challenging us to depend on God and to defend the cause and to hear the cry for justice. We may have transitioned from the prairies to outer space, but the God of life still says, I will never leave nor forsake you. I am with you always, even to the end. We should never bend to the forces of our times. The theology of life is God's gift to us, and it is our gift of hope to the world. We may not win the arguments. We may not see the fruits of the seeds we plant in our day, but we must plant the seeds anyway. There will be ethical dilemmas, and we will have to work out our choices related to them with fear and trepidation, praying that we will choose with wisdom and discernment. However, at the heart of our choice, life, fullness of life, must be the driver and driving force. So we plant the seeds of hope anyway. We must not bend, but live our truth faithfully. What does the Lord require of us? To live in and by truth, which may be painful and confrontational, but equally reconciling and hopeful. I will not bend. The renewal of our minds in our community of faith requires the rediscovery of love, patiently persistent in seeking the best of us for all of us. The renewal of the Spirit in our community of faith requires the rediscovery of a church on fire to go and grow and give. The renewal of our ethics in our community of faith requires us never to bow to the pressure of entitlement, but to remain faithful to God's purpose. The renewal of our attitude in the community of faith requires us never to bend regarding what is true. A mind to love, a spirit on fire, uncompromising ethics, undergirded by an unbending attitude. May God help us so to be and so to do. Amen. Thank you for joining us. May God continue to bless and use you.